One of the fascinating things about the prophet Jeremiah is we get more personal information about him than we do from any of the other prophets. It's not that we don't have information about Isaiah or Ezekiel or even some of the minor prophets like Amos or Obadiah, but Jeremiah is a very passionate prophet, and we get to empathize with him because we get to window into his soul, if you will, and get a look behind the curtain of the man who is the prophet. And you probably have heard somewhere along the lines that Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet. And so we're going to look at some of the information within the book itself that indicates that, that very personal nature of him. Before we do, I want to take a quick look at the date of Jeremiah and when he prophesied, because that does lend itself to the passionate mode of the book and why there is so much emotion involved in it. So let's look at the first three verses of the book of Jeremiah. The words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anatot, in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of King Josiah, son of Ammon of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. It also came in the days of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah, and until the end of the 11th year of King Zedekiah, son of Josiah of Judah, until the captivity of Jerusalem in the 5th month. So there's a lot of detail in there, and it's probably not information that you have right on the top of your head. So let's take a look and dissect this a little bit. So the 13th year of the reign of Josiah. So Josiah reigned from 640 to 609. So the 13th year would put that about 627. Some sources will list this as 626. In the 11th year of the reign of Zedekiah, and we know Zedekiah reigned from 597 to 586. So this puts the end of his prophecy at 586, which by coincidence, or not coincidence, I should say, is the captivity of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. So to look at this in a timeline, we see where Josiah reigned, there in the red, 627 BC. And then the end of Zedekiah's reign, the 11th year of Zedekiah in 586. So that you can see Jeremiah's ministry spanned a number of kings' reigns from Josiah, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and then Zedekiah, 627 to 586. So now let's look at Jeremiah, the personal prophet, the weeping prophet, and look at some of the information within the text itself that gives him that name. First of all, in Jeremiah's call, now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. And a couple of things I want to point out about this. So first of all, we don't have a lot of the prophets getting called. Now, of course, Isaiah's in Isaiah chapter 6 is the most famous of the calls. Of course, he had two calls, one in Isaiah 1 and one in Isaiah 6. But the other prophets really don't say much about their specific calling to prophetic ministry. Amos is also somewhat of an exception because he was, of course, he says, I was a shepherd in the lands of Tekoa. I was neither the prophet nor the son of a prophet. So we don't really hear about his calling there, but to demonstrate that he did at some point get called out of shepherding into prophecy. Anyway, so that's one point. The other point is this forming in the womb, this knitting in the womb, if you will, of Jeremiah. This is often used in a number of different ways to talk about, for example, the sanctity of life, and I think you can use it in that sense, but that is not really the point here. The point of Jeremiah's call is that God had a plan for Jeremiah specifically long before even Jeremiah considered what he might be up to in his life. All right, so this, while we might be able to apply this broadly to all people because God does know all things and is involved in creation of all things, this particular passage is specifically aimed at Jeremiah, and that the calling that Jeremiah received was one of, you might even say, cosmic proportions, because it took place before his birth even happened. I want to look now briefly at his age. because there is some debate, some discussion about this. There's nothing specifically stated within the book of Jeremiah to indicate how old he is. We do have these references here in Jeremiah 1, 6 through 8 about him being only a boy. Now, of course, we have to take that with some grain of salt because this is Jeremiah speaking. And so he may be underselling his own maturity here. Or he could be honest. It's just hard to say because of the perspective there. But also, part of the problem is that the word that is used to translate as boy is not something that really translates well into English. It's really could be refer to anyone from ages 4 to 40. I mean, it's really that broad of a term. So that doesn't really help us in terms of his age, other than the fact that Jeremiah seems to indicate that he's really not up to the task yet. But again, that might just be Jeremiah's own apprehension about the task that he has been called to do. The other passage, though, Jeremiah 16, 1 through 4, where God instructs him not to take a wife, that gives us a little bit more indication. It does help us narrow it down a little bit because it was uncommon for men in the ancient world, especially in ancient Israel, to not be old and celibate. All right, so in all likelihood, we're talking about Jeremiah being under the age of 20. In fact, we might even say in his mid to late teens. But that is all speculative. We can't know for sure. But that's the that's the limited information that we have based on the text itself. Another interesting thing about Jeremiah is that he had a scribe, and what is fascinating about this is it gives us a peek, a brief window into the scribal practice, the writing practice of the literary prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets as well. So we have here in Jeremiah 36, take a scroll and write on it all the words that I've spoken to you against Israel. So we have a specific instruction by God to write the words on a scroll. These are not oral commands then, right? These are words that are to be put into writing for to be handed off to kings, particularly the kings of Judah, so that they can take heed. But it's not just Jeremiah who's going to do it. He's going to write it through his scribe Baruch. So there you see in the second paragraph, Jeremiah called Baruch son of Neriah, and Baruch wrote on a scroll at Jeremiah's dictation. And then further down in the red, you shall read the words of the Lord from the scroll that you have written at my dictation. So we have kind of a two-step process here. God speaking to the prophet Jeremiah, then Jeremiah dictating those words to a scribe, who then writes those on the scroll. So that gives us a little insight into the authorship of these ancient scrolls. And so whether you agree that particular prophets are the authors of books, which I spoke a little bit about in previous lectures, or not, there is at least a step in there that involves a third hand, at least as described by Jeremiah, and there's no reason to suggest or think that this would not also be the case for other prophets. All right, so now let's look at Jeremiah's troubles. So first of all, he was told to be celibate. He was told not to take a wife because this was going to be a sign of impending judgment. He was beaten and imprisoned by the priest of Pashur because Pashur is not happy with what he's saying. Jehoiakim burns Isaiah's scroll, the one that he had dictated to Baruch, because Jehoiakim was unaffected by Jeremiah's warnings. They didn't have the intended effect of causing him to repent. He was thrown into a cistern by Zedekiah because Zedekiah thought his words were discouraging. He was declared a false prophet and then taken into Egypt because people didn't like what he had to say. So he endured a lot simply by obeying what God had told him to do. We also get a sense of his personality by the types of things that he says, some of his confessions, some of his own words. In chapter 9, he says, "Oh, that my head were a spring of water," and it goes on to talk about his eyes welling up, and the reason for this was so that he could weep day and night. He wished that he had the tears to continue shedding. He states that he's like a lamb before the slaughter, that his own people were betraying him. He says on a couple occasions in chapter 15 and chapter 20 that he curses the day that he was born, that he wishes that his mother had not borne him because everyone is cursing him. He prays that his persecutors would be crushed. This is a type of imprecatory prayer that we talked about in the Psalms lecture. And he states that, remember how I stood before you. And he's praying here for his adversaries. And again, Lord, you have deceived me. The words that Jeremiah expresses are the words that we hear so honestly expressed in so many of the Psalms. But finally, and we'll conclude with this slide, that Jeremiah is ultimately vindicated. He's vindicated on two counts. One, because his prophecies come true, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. And the second one is because Jeremiah is ultimately spared. Even though he endured a lot of hardship, a lot of trouble, a lot of turmoil, his life is ultimately spared. So hopefully that gives you a brief insight into Jeremiah, the weeping prophet.